Hello everybody, Jose Rodriguez back again. Let's talk about chips. No, not potato chips or corn chips, but the smart chips that are used in these new, and I mean by new, as of the turn of the century, ink cartridges for our printers. And they come in many different varieties and designs. So let's just kind of give a quick overview as to why do these chips even exist. The pros and cons, well, also the conspiracy theories as to why they were created to begin with. So let's go back in time to the early days of inkjet printing, and that was late 90s. There were a few models out there, and some of these cartridges just didn't have any chips. A chip for what? Canon printers had sponge type cartridges similar to the ones that we are used to, but they just didn't have that pesky chip, okay? Yeah, you could literally drill a hole, fill it, put a plug in it, pop it back into the printer, and the printer would see it as a full level cartridge again. Just simply removing it and popping it back in. That's all you really needed to do at the time. So enter the chips, and the chips were made basically to keep us also from refilling. That it was a secondary effect, or maybe it was a primary reason, who knows. I haven't spoken to any of these so-called engineers from these printer companies, but simply they needed to correct the very highly inaccurate prediction of how much ink had actually been used out of that cartridge. So you got to remember that back in the early days, we had a lot of simple printers that utilize a multicolor type cartridge. Takes me back to my very first real photo printer, so to speak, the EPSON 780. And that printer had two cartridges, one black cartridge and then one that contained 5 channels. In other words, 5 compartments. It had yellow, light and regular magenta, light and regular cyan. That's it. Here's what the problem was. They also had a chip, by the way. But the chip could not control individually those 5 channels of color. They were literally 5 compartments containing a sponge. Yes, Epson used to use sponge cartridges back then. The problem was that when one of those chambers was supposedly declared as empty, that was it. That was the end of that cartridge. And the other 4 channels or compartments may have had quite a bit of ink. To the trash. You had to replace it with a new one. Okay, and then depending on your predominance of your image's colors, you might repeat the same problem again because you might run out of one of those colors, and then the rest of the 4 channels that had ink, according to the chip, would be lost. They would be thrown away. There was no way to beat that, okay? Also, there were no resetters for you to reset those chips. No one had ever even thought about that at that point. And a couple of other models evolved from that again use the same type of system, the multicolor cartridges with one single chip. What a waste. Let's jump ahead now to a few years later. You had cartridges that had single channels separated in single individual cartridges to be used. That way you can then keep track of each color separately, and when one of them was declared empty, you could just remove it and not worry about the other colors because they were handled individually by their individual chips. Now, what is the chip really doing? Let's talk about that a second. The chip is not controlling your ink levels at all. Okay, did you know that? It is not. The ink levels, or the approximate ink levels, are controlled by the printers. It will try to guess, depending on your print that you just created, depending on how much plain paper, black ink only use you do, it will guess, estimate how much ink is being used during each one of these jobs. And after a certain amount of information or data is accumulated, it sends that information to the chip kind of as a chunk. And your level will drop like 20%, maybe 25%, depending on the printer. So it doesn't happen gradually. It happens in big jumps. So after a certain amount of printing, it will determine, guess, estimate. Yeah, it's not really accurate. How much ink has passed through the printhead, and at that point it will send that information. It will rewrite that level code on the chip to a lower level, okay? And it continues to do this until you reach empty. Now, some cartridges will give you a low warning, or just simply you visually look at it and yeah, it is low. And then when it reaches empty, that means that the printer says, hey, out of that particular channel, we have used up so much ink. And it sort of has something to do with the actual full volume of ink in that cartridge, but not so true. On a sponge type cartridge, which mostly are used in printers with thermal printhead technology, unlike EPSON, they cannot use up every drop of ink stored in that sponge. If you take a kitchen sponge and you soak it in water and you hold it up by the corner, some of the excess water will drip out, and then the rest will be held within the fibers of the sponge by what? Surface tension. It will not fully drip out. That is a condition that the sponge will be in when you reach the low warning on a cartridge such as this, meaning there's no more ink here. It cannot continue to replenish the sponge as you are creating a deficit from it by printing. Only air can enter now. Well, if you never are going to refill and you're using your cartridges until they are declared empty, you will use up some of that excess ink that is being held by surface tension inside that sponge or that fiber block, if you will. After a certain amount has been depleted, the chip will declare that cartridge empty. And the reason it does that is because it received that last bit of data from the printer. It got written into it. And now the chip tells the driver, hey, I'm empty, replace me. But is it really empty? Of course not. You can still suck out maybe 2 to 3 ml of ink out of that cartridge. And at the price that ink sells for per milliliter, that's a couple of dollars every single time you throw away a cartridge. But not much you can do about it because you cannot continue printing after that. You will harm your printhead. You need ink to keep the printhead cool. Okay, so other types of cartridges operate differently. Same typical type here as well. Everybody asks me, where's the chip? How do you reset it? The chip is right there. You can't miss it. Okay, so that's a chip. They come in different designs. There's a chip stored in that little black compartment. Here's another chip right there. And again, another type of chip. And yet another type of chip. These are all different chips. They have different coating in it. Okay? They operate differently. Now let's talk about some of the problems that occur with the inaccuracy, at least reporting, if you will, the actual ink levels in a cartridge. And what printer manufacturers have done to, I suppose they just don't want a printer to literally run out of ink physically. So let's go to our 3800, 3880 printers from EPSON, the Pro 3800, 3880s, and other large format printers that were part of the so-called Ultrachrome K3 ink technology. They all had your 9 channels, but only an 8-channel printhead. We won't talk about why. But anyway, you got a cartridge that is rated for 80 milliliters of ink volume, okay? But in reality, it comes loaded with 90. Now, there's something really interesting about the construction of these cartridges. They have an internal ink bag. Literally, it's a bag that is hermetically attached to the valve mechanism that allows ink to exit. There is no venting taking place internally. The ink leaves and the bag begins to collapse. The bag is being kept pressurized within the internal compartment of the cartridge by the printer. The printer has a little pump. It creates positive pressure. The pressure enters through this little port right here. It's a little hard to find. And that keeps the internal room, if you will, pressurized, and that pressure presses against the bag and thus provides a pressurized ink delivery system, if you will. So what happens? The chip is rated, it's rated for 80 milliliters of ink. Remember, it is not really determining how much ink is being used, but it's rated for 80. So as you are printing, just like with the earlier examples, the print head developing so many droplets of ink, it sort of knows what volume each one of these droplets is, and it's doing all of this computation. After a certain amount of time, a certain amount of ink has flowed out of the print head, it sends a signal to the chip and rewrites a new level code that is maybe 20% lower, and so on and so forth. When it reaches empty, there has to be ink in the bag. That bag cannot prematurely reach a fully collapsed condition while the printer still thinks they have ink to burn, if you will. No, that would be harmful. So it needs to compensate the opposite way. It has to be declared empty before that bag reaches the collapse point. Okay, so you still have literally, in most of these cases, 10 milliliters of ink. So remember, it comes with 90. So you get 10 free milliliters of ink. Sure you do. But that's the case here. So when this is declared empty, if I was to weigh it, it will weigh 10 grams more than if I was to remove all of the ink forcibly out of the bag. So there's always going to be a residual 10 milliliters of ink in these types of cartridges. And in this case, it runs about 70 something cents per ml. So you're throwing away some ink as well. And it does that because it's necessary. It cannot allow that bag to collapse. And since the printer is a pressurized ink delivery system, too bad. We pay the piper, and that's the way it goes. Now, Canon decided to join the pressurization game, if you will, and design the Pro-1, which didn't really quite work out so well. These are the only Canon cartridges that I know of that have an internal ink bladder. Okay, and they are kept pressurized and allow the ink delivery system to work because it is a stationary cartridge, although a desktop printer officially that delivers ink via positive pressure. Most other Canon printers use a gravity-fed system or at least a vacuum actuated system. Again, still have a chip, okay? And the chip is only there to receive information as the computer, if you will, inside the printer decides that enough ink has been used to drop it, say, 25%. When you finish with an empty cartridge, this weighs 43 grams empty. That means I pull every droplet of ink out of that bag. Guess how much this weighs right now? 53 grams. So from 43, which is bone dry empty, to 53, that's 10 grams of ink still in here, which again is just like with the EPSON printers, including the P800. They use the same style cartridge, and so will the P900 and P700 cartridges as well. You will have ink left, although maybe not as much. Maybe they have devised a way to at least allow you to use as much of the ink as possible, but it's still a bag type system and it's still positive pressure delivery. So it has to prevent the bag from ever being fully collapsed. So there's always going to be some ink left in them. The same thing with the Pro-10. The Pro-10 is also a semi-positive pressure, but it applies pressure only with an internal spring. And that applies pressure to the ink bag and allows the ink to be used. And in this case, pretty much you can go almost till empty. Okay, almost. Now, the one printer that I know is this one right here. This one will allow you to go full empty. Okay, it uses a system that is different than all of the other printers that we have discussed here. It has internal sensors as well as physical compartments that keep a physical eye on the amount of ink that has been fed through the printer. Remember, even though there's 80 in here right now, there's about 20 internally. And that ink is used, and then that triggers a response to allow ink to be delivered from the cartridge and so on. So it knows exactly how much ink is leaving, how much ink is coming in. When this chip is declared empty, it's not just because it just got sent a single signal to the chip. No, multiple systems are working hand in hand to determine the actual amount of ink. That's why printers such as these and the higher level printers from Canon can utilize a so-called accounting manager tool to determine to almost 100th of an ml accuracy how much ink is actually being used on a job. So it knows exactly when this is empty. When this is declared empty, I can take it out and weigh it, and it might weigh 33 grams. So there may be some, wetness in the internal walls of this cartridge body. So chips do not determine the actual levels of ink. They are simply devices that receive information that gets written to them, and then they report that information kind of visually to us, whether it is in the driver on your computer or in the case of an actual LCD screen. Many of these printers will have that functionality. You can see a facsimile, if you will, of the actual levels. Again, it's not going to be super accurate. Just keep that in mind. Now, I have been asked numerous times, on a printer such as this, should I change the cartridges when they appear to be low? And the answer, of course, is no. When it is low, it still has about 15 to 18, maybe even 20 grams of ink in it. Remember, ink is expensive, very expensive. And so you don't want to unnecessarily throw that ink out just because you're afraid of what? That the printer will stop printing mid-job. Now, in some situations, if the printer is smart enough, and these certainly are, P800 as well, P900, of course it is, they will determine, depending on the job that you are sending to it and the requirements for the area to be printed, it will make a determination and either stop you from printing that job or allow you to print that job. Now, in some cases, on less smart printers, the print job will stop midway, and you remove the empty cartridge, pop a new one in. It will run a purge cycle if it requires it, and it will continue printing where it left off. And you look at your result, and you don't even see any indication of where it stopped and where it began to print again. So they're really good, and you really do not have to worry about this type of situation. It'll be basically taken care of for you. Now, again, like I said, some printers will just say, hey, you don't have sufficient ink to print that job, especially a multi-copy type job. And at that point, you can decide not to print it. You can print something else, maybe a single set of prints until it reaches empty, and you replace that cartridge, and you can continue to then print that big job rather than try to begin to print it. So that, I think, is about it now. Resetting these chips. And everybody asks me about how to reset. Well, each type of chip requires a specific resetter, if there even is one available. And so the procedure is simple. You mate the pins on the chip, and most of them are either 7 or 9 pin type resetters to the resetter. And in this case, for a T58, it's as simple as that. And you wait for the green light to go on. This has got a dead battery on it. And this is why I highly, highly recommend the red setter type chip resetters, because they use USB power. Okay, you have a cord that you plug in. It will always provide you the correct voltage, the correct amount of power to produce a successful reset. And again, it's just a matter, this is the Pro-10. I don't have a Pro-10 cartridge with me. You would just insert it there like that. Wait for the red light to go on. It will go off afterwards when it is fully reset. And what does resetting mean? It is rewriting that code or full level code on the read and write section of the chip's memory. There are two distinct memories. One is read-only, that's the color ID. Okay, and each chip has a unique color ID for yellow, for instance. If they make 1,000,000 yellow chips, they will have 1,000,000 different color ID codes. Okay, the printer will then record that code, and it will know that printer has been inside me. Okay, and you reset it and put it back in. Yeah, I know you're cheating because I recognize the same ID code, the same fingerprint, if you will. But now I see full levels. If my firmware allows that, I will allow you to continue to print. But on printers such as the P800, P900, at least in the US, the firmware has been changed so that it will not allow you to put the same cartridge back in that same printer after you supposedly reset it. It will see the discrepancy of the same ID code when it was once declared empty and now it seems to be full. How can that be? You reset the same chip, didn't you? Yeah, it will not allow you to do that. Now, in other countries, maybe you can, but certainly not here in the US. All right, I think that's enough on that boring subject. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. Again, if you have any more questions about chips, and again, this is not a how to do things type video. I'm just trying to explain the intricacies about these chips and how they work. Again, keep in mind that they are not the actual component that is detecting the actual ink levels. Your printer is, and it's only an approximation, okay? So don't take that to the bank, okay? Don't take that to the bank. Now, before I go, one other little subject, refillable cartridges. So there are refillable cartridges for many Epson type printers, the earlier ones. Unfortunately, what happens, and this is an example of one for the so-called 3800 series. So they look the same size, but they really do not hold the same volume of ink. This cartridge can only physically hold about 70 milliliters of ink, whereas this one holds 90. The reason being is that there's just a bag internally, okay? And that bag takes up the whole amount of space in this container. This one does not. This one has a lot of internal baffles that you can see, and those walls, if you will, take up room, space. So I can only put 70. Now, the chips are unique. They use what is called a controller chip. All it does is reset itself to full when you remove it after it reaches empty and pop it back in. It still requires a matching color original OEM chip to identify itself as, say, a yellow cartridge or a magenta cartridge. But the controller chip will control the levels. It thinks you have the actual level of one of these. So it's always going to run out of ink on you physically because there's 20 milliliters less ink in these than on the original ones, literally. So when the chip says, hey, I still have 20%, you have already run out of ink. That's the catch. So you have to keep these refillable cartridges after about halfway, top them back off, all the way to the top. And that way you will never, ever physically run out of physical ink. You will always have ink. You will not lose your prime. You will then continue to provide the proper ink flow to your printer. Sure, the chip will tell you after it receives that information that, hey, I am now empty, but you're not really empty. Okay, you're like halfway or maybe even full. Okay, because you topped it off. At that point, remove the cartridge, pop it back in, it will reset to full. This is only on these older type printers, not the new ones. But keep in mind that the refillable cartridges, the chip versus the actual internal volume capacity doesn't match. Okay, so keep that in mind. You will save yourself a ton of headaches, a ton of problems that you will have to deal with if you simply create some sort of schedule for you to top these cartridges up. Okay, I got to do that with my P800. How's Jose printing with refillable cartridges in the P800? He lives in the US. I'm using a chip decoder board that costs $400. I've used my first reset accepting the first one when I installed the board. So I got 28 more resets to go. I don't think I'll be alive in this world by the time I need to replace that board or do something, right? It's just simply ridiculous. So I have to keep track. All my colors now are showing full. So I have to physically open that lid and keep track physically of each cartridge, how much ink is actually in them. And I did that when I did the reset. So that's the way it is. Anyway, enough of that. This can go on for hours if I wanted to, but I don't want to confuse people too much. Again, chips only receive the approximation information on your ink levels. It records it and it drops in chunks. When it is empty, that is it. If you have a way to refill those cartridges and you have a resetter, you can reset it, top off the cartridges back to full, and if the printer doesn't care to see the same color ID, you're good to go. That's the case in many of the older Canon printers, not so much on the new ones. All right, thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and like. And until the next time, happy printing, everybody. Bye-bye.